broadcasting now, Arunabha.
Great. We can maybe we wait for, it's still 3:59. Maybe we'll wait for 1 more minute, and then we will get going.
I think what you're seeing at the bottom is, I don't know if you, I think you have that at the bottom under participants. You see the number of people coming in, streaming in, because these are the people that were kind of in the waiting chamber and coming in. Mm-hmm. So let's give them, that's why I want to give them 1 minute maybe after the time to make sure that people can come in. I see Robert Jan Jekyll. Robert Jan, can you hear me?
Yes, very well, André. Hi.
Hi. Well, we have 62 people now on the online, Arunabha, and apparently we have 200 registered. So
well over 200 registered.
Yeah, over 200 registered. So we're 65 and counting.
Yeah,
it's 12:30. It's 12:30 sharp now. So let's give it a couple of minutes.
Sure.
Before we can do this.
Sure.
Yeah. Well, Michael, it's 6 in the morning or something like that, 6:30 in the morning. We didn't get Aaron because it was 3:30 in the morning, and we decided that was a little bit beyond the call of duty.
Happy afternoon, Chanakya.
Nice quote.
Hi, good afternoon.
Hi, glad you could join. I thought you had some connection problems.
Yeah, I was having some problem. Yes.
Somebody raised the hand. Okay, that's okay.
No, मेरा पेन दे देना अगर बदल गया. ये क्या कर रही है?
So what is the normal percentage, Arunabha? In Brussels, the percentages are 65% usually. What is the percentages in what are the percentages in India when you have something like this? Do you have
it's usually in the 65 to 75 range. 2 weeks ago, we had 65 to 75%. I mean, 2 weeks ago, however, we well exceeded. We launched our latest report for jobs growth and sustainability. We had more than 25,000 viewers.
Wow.
That's a good audience.
That's a record, I heard.
Yes.
So what do you do that on? You don't do that. You don't do that Zoom, do you? I mean, I don't know what you do.
We had to do it on WebEx because, and then we had live streamed it on Facebook. So that's how you get the viewership.
All right. Well, I think that, Arunabha, I think we should get going. It's 30. I know that the number is at 94, 95 or so, but I think it's 3 minutes into the call. I think we should get
start.
going.
We have a tight schedule, so maybe we should
start.
Look,
let me get started in that case and just introduce myself ever so briefly. My name is André Marcoux. I'm the executive director of the European Roundtable on Climate Change and Sustainable Transition. It's a long name. And it was a name that was chosen because we wanted to signal all along our preoccupation with addressing climate change and through a sustainable transition. And through a sustainable transition, we understand that the social, economic, and environmental axis should be in harmony in such a way that we do not leave anybody behind. So that's an important element. We are very pleased today to join forces with Arunabha Ghosh and his colleagues. The topic of the day is EU border carbon adjustment. We will go into this, but the EU has put forward in some of its documents a proposal, or the idea of a proposal on border carbon adjustment, in addressing some of the concerns that exist in Europe, and we'll get into that later. And one of the things that we have decided to do, I don't know how Delhi works, I know how Washington works, I know how Ottawa works, is that there is a bubble or a beltway. And these people talk to each other a lot, but they don't talk to others. So one of the things that we thought it was very important is to hear what others around the world have to say about their thinking and the incipient proposal is putting forward. So we reached out to a number of people, and one of them, of course, was Arunabha, with his stature and the stature of the Institute and the work that you have done. We want to thank you for joining us and putting this together. We hope for a very vigorous debate, and a debate that would signal to Europeans and others the kind of vision and reaction that people have around the world of some of these proposals. It's important, and we hope it's going to take into account. Arunabha, I'd like to invite you now to take the floor.
Thank you, Andre, and good afternoon, everyone. I am Arunabha Ghosh. I'm the CEO of the Council on Energy, Environment and Water. Very warm welcome to all of you for joining this joint webinar that CEEW and ERCST are hosting this afternoon. It's very clear that the European Green Deal has strengthened the level of climate ambition, increasing the asymmetry of climate efforts by aiming to achieve climate neutrality in the European Union by 2050. At the same time, emerging economies like India, at least until the pandemic hit, were leapfrogging towards an energy transition, whether in terms of building significant amounts of renewable energy capacity, investing in energy efficiency across large industry, investing in new ambitions for sustainable mobility, sustainable cooling, and even sustainable agriculture. The question that then remains to be answered is, how are these measures going to be accounted for as one major region, in this case the European Union, starts thinking about something as important as border carbon adjustments? The last time I spoke on this subject, again on a webinar that ERCST had hosted on the 25th of March, was effectively just a day after India had declared lockdown number 1. And since then, we have gone through 4 lockdowns and 1 phase of unlocking. In this period, it has become very clear that India and other emerging economies are going to have a severe economic downturn as a result of the global pandemic. It has also become quite clear that a lot of the most vulnerable sections of the population are affected by this public health and economic and humanitarian crisis. Despite this worldwide challenge, the expected reductions in carbon emissions this year is about 5.5 to 6%, the steepest fall ever recorded. And yet it will fall short of the 7.5% annual reduction in greenhouse gas emissions that the UN Environment Programme estimates is needed over the course of this decade to stay within the 1.5 degrees Celsius target. This is a conundrum. A worldwide lockdown is not good enough to keep our emissions at check. At the same time, countries have to make hard choices, not just about getting their economy to be moving again, but maintaining or sustaining the momentum that was already there, especially in emerging economies, towards a cleaner energy transition. Those hard choices can result in short-term or myopic decisions, or they can result in strategic actions that can take us forward. Will those intentions be hindered or supported if another region decides to raise trade barriers based on climate change? CEEW is a 10-year-old independent organization. We've been ranked number 1 in South Asia in our domain areas for 7 years in a row, and amongst the 20 best climate think tanks in the world. Our work is to try and integrate issues of energy, climate change, trade, global governance, as well as national and local policies to see where we can find the most evidence to drive a sustainable transition for India and the rest of the world. In this webinar, we have got a stellar panel of speakers ranging from a former minister and a current parliamentarian, representatives of industry, specifically the cement and steel industries, but also industry overall, as well as academia, people who've been looking at this issue very carefully. So you will hear from all of them about not the India perspective, but also what we believe should be the governance mechanism for the world as a whole as we come out of this pandemic and as we try and sustain the objectives that we've set for ourselves. But before we go down that route, I'm going to turn back again to our co-host, Andre Marcoux, who and his colleague, Michael Melling, who will then present what the situation is with regards to the European proposal so that we have an opportunity to react and respond and contribute. Thank you again for joining this webinar. Over to you, Andre.
Thank you, Arunabha. We're very anxious and very keen. We recognize the quality of the panel, and we're very grateful to you and your colleagues for assembling such a brain trust. We are think tanks, and as think tanks, we should value above all thinking and intellectual input. With this, we can say that so far is already a success, given the people that we have on this. We are concerned, and the concern comes from the fact that the Paris Agreement is a promise, and it's a promise that we're all going to be moving in the same direction with an increasing level of ambition and scarcity. Whether that is the case or not, so far it looks like Europe is very ambitious. Others may be less so ambitious. So one of the scenarios that we may end up facing is a world with asymmetrical climate change policies, as well as a world with different type of ways of addressing competitiveness and carbon leakage. And that is not a world that is a recipe for great success. Now, what I will do is I'll go on and share the screen, and we'll go through our presentation, and then Arunabha will take over, and then we'll get a reaction from the Indian stakeholders. So Arunabha will take over, and we'll get views from Indian stakeholders. We'll then go on to Robert Jan Jekyll, who's the head of European and Institutional Affairs at ArcelorMittal in Brussels. And we will then continue the discussion with the audience. So let me, if I get it right, I will share the screen. If not, God help me. But I hope I will manage it in a first thing. So
I can see your screen.
Then I think that we are in good hands to start. So now, why are we discussing this? And I think that you have signaled this to some degree, at least our interpretation, and we want to make it clear. We have discussions with this with other people, and we made it very clear this is not an official dialogue. This is a dialogue that's led by think tanks, as it should be at this point, I believe. But the reason why we think that we're getting into this discussion right now is the fact that there are asymmetrical climate change policy, that there are increasing levels of ambition, and old methods to deal with certain issues such as competitive pressures and carbon leakage may not be working or will not be working in the future. That is our assessment. So in terms of asymmetrical climate policies, as I mentioned, Paris is a promise that we will all have moving in the same direction. So far, we're not quite seeing that. In terms of level of ambition, you do know that the European Green Deal is promising, or it makes the proposal, and the proposed climate law makes the proposal for a carbon neutrality at 2050, which makes it a little bit more ambitious than the Paris Agreement, which talks about the second half of the century. But also climate neutrality in 2050 also means CO2 neutrality in 2040. So that is fairly fast. Also, the other thing is that so far we've had visible carbon prices in Europe through the EU ETS. It's been a bit of a ride, going from 30s back to 5, back to 25, back to 14. So there's been a bit of a ride. One would argue there are objective reasons that is the case, but nevertheless, there has been a carbon price. And that carbon price has been mitigated through what is the classic, if you want to put it, free allocation and compensation of indirect costs. And that has worked because there has been enough reallocation, has worked because we have used CERs and from CDM, and has also worked because we faced what we thought at that point was an unprecedented economic crisis that we had hoped not to see again in our lifetimes. Also, we had thought that what is my dream and what I've been working for 20 years, a global carbon price has not yet materialized. Border carbon adjustment is now being seen as being put forward as the solution in dealing with carbon leakage and competitiveness. But other solutions are also being contemplated. Consumption charges, which basically is a charge based on weight and type of material, a carbon price. So this is something that is charged to consumer downstream. Carbon contract for difference, where a carbon price is being guaranteed, a bit like a put financial instrument or a feed-in tariff. It needs to be seen in the context of the European Green Deal. As I said, carbon neutrality, increasing targets 2030 now at 40%, and envisaging a change according to the Commission proposal somewhere in 50 to 55% range, according to the rapporteur of the Environment Committee in the Parliament at 65%. So these are quite significant numbers. The steepness of the curve almost doubles in certain circumstances. That's fairly significant. Border carbon adjustment is part of this deal. I mean, basically the promise is, listen guys, we will go to 55, 60%, whatever, but don't worry, there is going to be a carbon border adjustment mechanism to address carbon leakage and competitive and trade impacts. There's a timing issue in the sense that we expect that the increase in targets will be addressed this year, while the promise for the CBAM, because we have a new name, it's called CBAM now, is only supposed to come in next year. So there is some discontinuity in there in timing, and that is, if I were in business, would not be a minor thing for me. The Green Deal, probably most of you have heard enough about it because it's been around now for 6 months. The thing that, it's for those of you that are old enough, you remember that movie, everything you always wanted to know but were afraid to ask, this is everything that you always wanted to have in order to change society and change and reduce emission to net zero is here. The ambition, transportation, farm to fork, building renovation, everything is here with different provision, a fairly general communication. But then there's clearly the blue boxes at the bottom where the money comes from, and there's a talk of €1 trillion, and the leave no one behind. So the just transition mechanism and fund, which is now about 40 billion, raised from 7.5 billion. These are also things that are not to be left to be ignored. Now, the genealogy of this very quickly, in the middle of next year, about a year ago, the incoming president of the Commission talked about the carbon border tax on selected sectors, gradually extended and fully compliant with WTO. So that was the initial salvo that was included in my agenda for Europe. Then, as in many governments, probably your government, having a bit of a Westminster tradition, there's a letter. That's what we have in Canada. We have a letter to the minister from the Prime Minister saying what you're going to do for why I make you minister. And it says you should lead the proposal also on carbon border tax to avoid carbon leakage and ensure competitiveness in WTO rules. But then in the European Green Deal communication on December 11, we saw something slightly different, where the language is changed now to carbon border adjustment mechanism for selected sectors, clearly, and complying with WTO as an alternative to the current measure that address carbon leakage in the EU ETS. In that's our bracket, I believe. Now, what is the state of discussion? You know, and probably I believe there are a few commission people online listening, and member states from EU member states. So I will let them intervene if I misrepresent this. But my perception, and Andre's perception, is that there's a fair bit of support, political support for this. We see the Spanish minister kind of pushing to speed up this BCA announced or CBAM announcement for middle of next year to this year, supported by Germany, France, and Italy. We also see statements in political statements in May on support of the CBAM from Germany and France. Germany, we know, France, we know they've always been supportive. Germany is something that I'm, again, Andre Marcoux interpretation, I do not know whether it is as deep as in France. It's clearly a political support. There seems to be a lot more hesitation in the business community. We'll talk about it. And then Poland also seems to be supportive. The other ones, I have not yet done any kind of survey on this. The other interesting thing to notice is that this is BCA in some way related to the EU ETS. However, it is so one could expect that it would fall under the remit of the DG Klima, but these things fall under the remit of DG Taxud, and this is the way it is now. It is being led by DG Taxud. Now, what the EU does, if I'm describing this correctly, is that there's a communication from the Commission of the European Green Deal. And then there is something called an Inception Impact Assessment. This Inception Impact Assessment, which was released on March 4th and had a feedback period where people could comment on this 4-page or 5-page document without specific questions. So you could write anything you wanted for the period 4th of March to April 1st. Essentially talks about doing what will be in the impact assessment. Any proposed legislation in the EU has to have an impact assessment. So this kind of outlines what you're going to do in the impact assessment. Once you say that, also give Vol and Snow some direction on what is the thinking and what are the direction that the proposal may come around. So what are the things that we see in this document? We see that there's a type of policy instrument, which is a carbon tax on selected products, imports and exports, a new carbon customs duty or tax on imports only, or potentially an extension of the ETS to imports, a little bit like the California one, where imports would have to hold allowances the same way as local producer would have to do. The other thing that will be studied is a methodological approach to evaluating the carbon content and carbon pricing of imported products. The third one is sectoral scope. You know, who do you cover with this, and is there a gradual start, or is it up? You cover everybody. We did a bit of an analysis of this, and there were 219 submissions, substantial amount coming from all kind of organization inside and outside the EU. The key things that I would say is that most of these the submission followed on the perceived objective of a BCA, whether it focuses or should focus on an environment, on the competitive aspects, on the diplomatic aspects, the fiscal, what do you do with the money? Developing policy options. So what kind of policy option you use? What do you do with the money, the use of revenues, and how do you operationalize this? Do you operationalize this as a cooperative approach or more of an adversarial approach? Our takeaway is that there is a high degree of interest. There is generally positive, with caveats, expression from NGO and business circles. Again, it is early in the game. You can't comment in negative on things that you haven't seen, but we've seen a few large federations like the German Auto Federation, like the German Chamber of Commerce Association, being very cautious in this. And the fact that there will be clearly discussion on how to design this mechanism. Most people actually focusing more on jumping the step of the impact assessment, jumping directly on the discussion of what it is. Now, what I mentioned at the beginning in my introduction, and I didn't want to shoot my bullets first, was that the ERCST, very complicated name of our think tank, is running a project called Border Carbon Adjustment in the EU Issuer Option. This is a project that is being funded by the German Federal Ministry of Environment and the French government, together with the Steel Federation, with the Association of Refiners, Enel, which is the big Italian power company, very deep into renewable, through Solvay, Heidelberg Cement. So a mixed bag, if you want. We try to make sure that we're not beholden to anybody in particular. We are not a consulting organization. And what we did is dissected CBAMs in design options. We held a number of roundtable, including an international one, where Arunaba and people from the US Congress and OECD participated. That gave us the idea of actually injecting in this study as much as possible views from outside the EU. That it's important to hear that. It's very important to hear how the world perceived this. So you are number two. We had one with the US of A, with the Nicholas Institute at Duke University. Upcoming is the Republic of Korea, Japan, and then in probably after summer break, South Africa, Mexico, Russian Federation, Ukraine, and probably Brazil. Now, how do we approach this? We approach it by 9. Okay, then what I will do here, I will pass it to Michael Melling. And Michael, you take over for here. I got used to do this presentation alone this morning, so I was gonna go on and on and on. So thanks God I remember.
Thank you, Andre. Is my audio working okay?
It is, it is. Perfect.
Thank you also, of course, for the opportunity to participate here in this very illustrious panel, and to our co-hosts, CEEW and Arunaba. What I'll do is briefly sort of show how we're approaching the analysis, this prospective analysis of BCAs. I think that for an Indian audience, the question may arise, why is that really interesting to us and relevant? I think the relevance of that comes from being able to have a sense of the direction in which the EU might take this policy proposal in its design, and what some of the crunch issues will be that are worth keeping an eye on, because they may be what holds up or otherwise creates problems in the process. We, in the previous slide, you don't have to go back though, but what we essentially have tried to do is dissect, all the different elements of a BCA. So break it down in design and implementation steps that have to be taken. There's a number of decisions that have to be made in that context. And then evaluate the options for each of these design steps. There's in each case 2, 3, 4 ways that the EU could do it, and evaluate it across or along a matrix of 5 criteria. In order to be able to compare some of these options and show which of them raise significant problems, say, for instance, on a legal front, WTO law, EU law, or on a political front, or technically and administratively, while still trying to achieve the main objectives of, preventing leakage, helping other countries or incentivizing other countries to speed up their action, but of course also protecting the competitiveness of EU industry by leveling the playing field. And in the end, based on this decomposition, if I can use that term, we built a few scenarios that we think could be sort of directions that the EU takes, depending on how the political debate goes. So if things become complicated politically, then the EU might play it very safely and take a somewhat weaker, more symbolic approach to the BCA. But if the speed of the recent months in terms of the European Green Deal and the ambition that we've seen there, and that momentum keeps up, then it could in fact be a very aggressive BCA with a completely different design. If I go to the next slide, please.
Do you see the next slide, Michael?
Yes, yes. It just took a little while to come through. I think since we're spread across the world now, North America, Europe, and Asia, it's a little bit slower. So one example of how to break this down, just the first design step that you saw on the previous slide was the trade flow. Which trade flows would be affected? Would it affect only imports, as some of the statements and documents of the EU have suggested? Would it also do something for exports? So also apply to exports, say, by exempting or rebating European products as they leave the EU market, or would it apply to both? And you can see that one can already start, we gave a lot of thought to, you know, what are the implications of each of these options under the various criteria, and it starts giving you a heuristic picture. It's not, of course, precision, rocket science precision, but it does give sort of an ability to start comparing how these different options fare across the different criteria. If we move to the next slide, there we looked at, this is an example of one of the scenarios where we start looking at specific options that we think would fit under this scenario. So based on the current documents, based on the statements of high-level officials, and where the debate has been going so far, we think that the most probable scenario will involve a number of design choices, and we evaluate that. And it balances very much sort of the feasibility, the viability, with at the same time achieving most of the environmental benefits and competitiveness benefits. But it's certainly not the most aggressive nor sort of the safest approach. Again, I don't want to go in terrifically much detail. One can, as we have done in several previous webinars, spend an hour or more just breaking down all the components. If we look at the next slide, Andre already mentioned that we're also, well, here is a summary. This is perhaps, since we will make the slides available for anybody who is interested in having a look at the three scenarios and all the different design choices that we assume for each scenario and how in aggregate those rate. Please refer to the slides as they will be made available. Again, I don't want to spend too much time. Andre also mentioned on the next slide that we are looking at alternative instruments that could at least achieve some of the objectives of a BCA, such as including consumption in the European emissions trading system, using carbon contracts for difference, using product standards, and some other instruments, each of them with their own relative strengths, but none of them really a silver bullet to deal with the problems that the BCA is meant to deal with. And again, what's interesting here is to explore whether there are certain combinations that would help or allow designing one of them, such as the BCA, the border carbon adjustment, in a safer, legally more likely or viable way, etc., by taking care of some of the aspects that the BCA design can only do if it's a really aggressive and risky design. So different combinations of these instruments, I think, are also something that one should keep in mind, and I'm sure that the debate in Europe will do so. And in fact, the Inception impact assessment even refers to one option that goes in the direction of including consumption potentially in the domestic market. Now, if we move to the final two slides, this is just some very high-level takeaways. Again, I think primarily the interest here for an Indian audience is just to have a sense of some of the crunch issues and some of the, say, milestones or steps to watch out for as this debate proceeds in Europe. And it has been very much a domestic debate so far, despite some selected outreach activities. And I think ERCST has been one of the busiest on that front. First of all, trade flow coverage. I think that there will be a significant debate about what happens if it only applies to imports, as has been suggested so far, because that does very little to protect the competitiveness of EU products in all foreign markets, so the rest of the world. And there will need to be a discussion about that. And this may involve some way of continuing free allocation for exports, but even replacing free allocation for domestically sold goods in the EU market will likewise face considerable pushback. That much, I think, has become clear from the discussions with stakeholders so far. So there will be political, this is a big political hurdle, I think, to overcome if free allocation is to be replaced quickly. And I think most stakeholders, such as Business Europe, et cetera, are pushing for at least some sort of gradual phased replacement of free allocation with a BCA. Sectoral scope, again, very likely, we think, to avoid some of the biggest political and also legal risks, is that it will start, and the documents have also underscored that or support that, with a relatively narrow scope. So something such as cement, which is not traded too intensely. This also limits the trade partners that are affected to a much smaller number of countries across the European border. The same would apply if electricity is included, and some have proposed and pushed for doing so, because there is indeed cross-border electricity trade across the European border in the east and in the south of Europe, with significant carbon implications as well. It's typically much more carbon-intensive electricity. How to determine embedded emissions, often an argument used by critics of this instrument. It's technically impossible to do so, to determine what the emissions embedded in an iPhone are. Well, very likely that is not a problem that will have to be dealt with. Instead, if we're talking about some selected basic goods, the EU can even avoid having to do product by product determination and instead use a default value, such as an average carbon intensity, using maybe the European average carbon intensity, and assuming that all imports have that, potentially coupled with an individual adjustment option that producers from abroad can show with independently third-party verified, emission certificate. They have measured and reported their emissions, and those have been verified, what their actual emissions intensity is if they are less carbon intensive, if they are cleaner. Again, the choice of default value, is it a best available technology, worst available technology, or just an average, for instance? That will play a large role and have significant implications for the environmental effectiveness, but also for the legality and political viability of the mechanism, we think. Finally, revenue use is another politically very sensitive topic. The EU, as some of you may have seen in the news, when it issued its next generation EU recovery package about 3 weeks ago, it included as sources of the funding for the 750 billion euro recovery package, 5 to 14 euros of revenue from the BCA. That tells you something. If the EU is already starting to incorporate revenue from a future instrument, it suggests that they are quite serious about implementing it. How that revenue is spent, whether it stays within the EU, say for innovation, to subsidize the industries affected by this, potentially to deal with downstream cost increases for, say, car manufacturers, et cetera, that now suddenly face more expensive steel imports. That would be one option, and there will be a lot of domestic political pressure to do so. At the same time, of course, internationally, there will be probably requests. Essentially, this is foreign money being retained in the EU that could be charged with a carbon price in the countries of origin of the products. So of course there would be, it would be preferred by, I think, foreign producers if that money stayed in the country of origin. This could be international climate finance, but of course that also is politically sensitive, since it would essentially be recycling money from other countries back to other countries. So there's many options, and each of them have political challenges. Finally, the last slide. Some high-level takeaways that apply across. The previous slide was on specific design choices, some high-level observations. I think we have to assume that despite the narrative that it will be WTO compatible, that there is a very high likelihood that it will at least violate Article 1 and 3 of the GATT most favored nation and national treatment principles, and that the only way to make it WTO compatible is to ensure that it falls under the exceptions of Article 20 of the GATT, and for that it has to be environmentally motivated. Also very importantly, I think, for foreign countries is Article 20 in its chapeau, based on the case law interpretation of that sort of introductory statement, requires a very transparent, inclusive and multilateral process. So this is where India and other countries that may be affected by this measure will or should have the opportunity to participate, to voice their concerns, and to potentially even see if there's any way that action on climate policy can avert, imposition of a BCA. And the EU is, of course, aware of that. And that is, I think, one of the next steps that we're hoping to see, is this more robust multilateral process to discuss the BCA. There are intrinsic trade-offs across many of these criteria. I mentioned that earlier. A more aggressive, environmentally or competitiveness-wise more aggressive BCA will typically incur more legal, political, and technical challenges. And so generally one can say that, the more the broader and more granular and detailed it is, it will have greater risk compared to something that's much narrower and uses more aggregation, but then it also will be less effective. Some of the really intractable issues is how does one deal with downstream impacts if one only targets 2, 3, or 4 sectors and the cost increases down the value chain? How does one deal with substitution effects if, for instance, one includes cement but not steel, and one will have potentially in the construction, in the building industry, a shift from one to the other product? To some extent, they may be desirable if it switches to more environmentally desirable, lower carbon intensity alternatives, but in some cases, these may not be desirable. And dealing with that and predicting them is not easy and will be a challenge. Another big issue is how to avoid resource shuffling. Unless one uses very broad averages and instead tries to, for instance, offer foreign producers the opportunity to show their actual carbon intensity, well, then you open the door to those producers selling the cleaner products to the EU and retaining the less clean, the more carbon intensive products for their domestic market or third markets. And dealing with that is really a challenge. California, which has a BCA, has had that challenge and found it difficult to deal with it. And finally, I think, as I mentioned earlier, no other instrument is a full alternative for a BCA, but they can certainly complement the BCA, and different combinations could potentially deal with the objectives that the BCA seeks to achieve in a better way. So I think the discussion should and will encompass those as well. So thank you very much for this, for bearing with us in this sort of dive into the EU debate and what they have been saying and where the direction could go with the border carbon adjustment. And here is back to the moderators.
Thank you very much, Michael. I think that takes us into the end of the first segment, if you wish. We try to the best of our abilities to outline the origin of this debate in Europe at this time, and some of the, kind of the background of what's going on, the noise in the background, and some of our ideas, how we are looking at this project and the ideas that we want to put forward. Now, I think that which really, it's a background discussion. The most important part while we're here is to listen to our Indian colleagues and hear the Indian town hall speak. And I pass it on to my friend Arunabha Ghosh.
Thank you, Andre and Michael, for a very detailed briefing on where the issue stands within the European Union. In this segment, we are running a little behind, but I'm going to buy into a little bit of the time we have in the latter half of this webinar, so that we get enough time to hear from our Indian representatives. What I'll do is I will introduce each of our speakers one by one, and then request them to offer their thoughts. We're going to start with Mr. Jairam Ramesh. Mr. Ramesh is currently a member of parliament representing the state of Karnataka in the upper house of India's parliament, the Rajya Sabha. He has previously held several ministerial portfolios in the ministries of rural development, drinking water and sanitation. He held independent charge of the Ministry of Environment and Forest, especially around the time of the Copenhagen climate negotiations. He was Environment Minister from 2009 to 2011. He has also been Minister of Commerce, Minister of Power, and has also, under previous avatars, served as an advisor to Prime Minister Narasimha Rao in the early 90s and to the Finance Minister in the mid-90s. Mr. Ramesh is also an author of several books, many of which adorn my bookshelf behind me. Jairam, turning to you first. You've been a champion of low carbon development in India, but have also pushed back, especially when you were in government, pushed back against use of climate as a non-tariff barrier, in your words. With climate risks rising and India's responses on renewables, energy efficiency, on mobility coming through, what opportunities or challenges emerge from this kind of a proposed border carbon adjustment mechanism from the EU? How might it weaken or strengthen global climate governance and India's position within it?
Well, Arunabha, I don't think it'll fly. I think it's one of those typical, European ideas, legally binding treaty type of ideas. Frankly, it leaves me cold because I don't see how it's going to be WTO compatible. I mean, we've been discussing this for 10 years. I mean, first time this came up, I remember in the run-up to Copenhagen in October 2009. And at that point of time itself, I had pointed out that there is a fundamental contradiction between such border adjustment mechanisms, which basically impose taxes on carbon-intensive products and the WTO rules and regulations. I just don't see how this, this incompatibility is going to be resolved. I just frankly don't see it at all happening. Now, one can argue that the WTO rules are moribund in themselves, and that the WTO is probably at its weakest right now. But if you want the climate debate to stall, by all means, go ahead with the border adjustment mechanism idea. If you want countries to come on board, particularly the bigger countries, China, India, other countries, then I think one should be a little more realistic. And this proposal is just not going to fly. This is my view. I mean, and I think on this, I don't speak for the government of India, but I can assure you that the government of India will take the same position, that, this is in violation of the WTO rules. India can never be party to it. We can discuss global carbon tax and so on and so forth, but anything that smacks of an additional cess or a tax on international trade is simply not going to be acceptable. In any case, Arunabha, right now, anybody who talks of international trade, probably out of his mind, because the concerns are quite different. And the real challenge is to get economies back on their feet. Trade, of course, is going to be a lubricant of this. But, the next 12 to 14 months, I don't see global trade booming. But if we're going to keep talking about border adjustment, I can assure you that whatever little progress we've made on climate, that also is going to get stalled.
So, Jairam, before I turn to the other speakers, if I might come back to you once again, you've engaged even as, when you were dealing with the Commerce Ministry as well, the WTO through and through as well. As you just said, it is somewhat of a moribund organization right now. Now, suppose, as the briefing presentation showed us, the proposal after this consultation period is over is likely to be tabled sometime in 2021. If there is this unilateral move, where do the other countries then go to kind of challenge the move, especially if the WTO route is closed?
Unfortunately, the dispute settlement mechanism, Mr. Trump has made sure that
exactly
the dispute settlement mechanism has been toned down. Remember, Arunabha, that WTO is a multilateral agreement, but it has plurilateral windows. For example, the government procurement agreement under the WTO is not multilateral, it's plurilateral. India is not a party to that agreement. So you could have a plurilateral window in a multilateral framework. But, this is a confidence destroying measure. This is not a confidence building measure. It's a confidence destroying measure in both climate and international trade. And I have yet to see, and I have an open mind, I have yet to see a way in which it can be made completely and unequivocally WTO compatible. If there is a way, let's discuss that.
Sure.
But stating it as a goal and a philosophy is one thing, but actually demonstrating it is quite something else.
Okay, that's great. I think that's a great segue to our next speaker. Dr. Kasturi Das is an economist, trade and climate policy practitioner, and an educator of more than 20 years. She's a professor of economics at the Institute of Management Technology in Ghaziabad in the Delhi National Capital Region. She's also served as a Chevening Research Science and Innovation Leadership Fellow at Oxford. She serves as a member of the High-Level Advisory Committee on Trade and Environment in the Department of Commerce in the Government of India, and has also been a member of World Economic Forum's expert group on trade and climate change. Kasturi, if I may turn to you now, just taking on from where Minister Ramesh left off. You've been researching the linkages between trade and climate change for many years. And many of your recent publications have suggested that there might be alternative routes to combat emissions as well as combat trade protectionism. So what do you think the EU should do, and how do you think India should respond?
Okay, can you hear me, Aruna?
We can hear you very clearly.
Yeah, okay. Thank you so much. And first of all, it's a pleasure to be here on this platform, part of the conversation, which is very interesting already. And I must thank Arunabu, CEEW, and ERCST for the opportunity. Taking forward the discussion that has already happened, I must tell you that I don't come from government, and I'm not going to talk about any political position here. What I'm going to do here is I'm going to make a few comments regarding the WTO compatibility and where there may be issues relating to that, some of which has been very well already covered in the excellent presentation that Andre and Michael have already made. I thought I'll just make a few points regarding the designing, etc. So the first point I'd like to make here, and I agree with Jairam Rameshji that WTO compatibility has been one of the most difficult and contentious issue regarding any proposal on border carbon adjustment. But as far as my research, and we have done some joint research with colleagues here, that shows, and I have been working on this particular area since 2008 in the run-up to the Copenhagen summit. We started working on this when there was a proposal from the European Union. Since then, I have been working on this. Now, there are few points I would like to emphasize, keeping in view the suggestions that have already come from the presentation Michael and Andre have made. The first point is that whether we can make it WTO compatible or not, yes, it would be really challenging to make it WTO compatible. However, I feel, based on my understanding and research of WTO law and different jurisprudence that we have, that it is still possible for a country to design a border carbon adjustment in a manner that may be potentially WTO compatible. However, I must point out at the very beginning that the devil would finally lie in the details of how the mechanism is designed and implemented. And here comes a few points that I would like to emphasize on, given the short of time that I would not get into all the 9 design elements that have been discussed in the presentation already, but a few points. The first is regarding the policy objectives underlying the border carbon adjustment, and I would emphasize that it's very clear that if you have to find WTO compatibility, then the best bet would be Article 20 of General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, which allows under its Article 20 a window of opportunity for countries to come up with policies on the grounds of environmental protection. However, this particular article, while it does give a window, it also requires a lot of things to be taken into account, while from the very beginning regarding the objective of the measure as well as its designing and implementation. And a very important point that is incorporated in the introductory paragraph of this article or the CEEW is that there are enough safeguards to ensure that the member country of WTO who is planning to come up with a BCA does not do it in a manner which is protectionism and may have adverse trade implications, which is not justifiable. Now, in order for you to pass muster this Article 20 test, and there are a lot of requirements, and there is no time for us to get into details. Some of these Michael already pointed out. Few points I would like to mention which may make the possibility of WTO compliance better. One is what you do regarding the underlying policy objective, and it has to be environmental. So the BCA should be designed and implemented in a manner that it results in real emission reduction by reducing maybe the carbon leakage, but it cannot be done in a manner which is trying to protect the European industries on the grounds of competitiveness. That I should make it very clear as far as my understanding goes. So in that context, it makes sense for you to incorporate imports only rather than also export, because export rebate, if you incorporate, that may not help you to pass the environmental ground, which is very much needed under Article 20. The second point I'd like to mention here is regarding the revenue. As Michael pointed out, it's a very politically sensitive area. But if you look at it strictly from legal as well as political angle, I think, if you can recycle the revenue that you're collecting from a BCA back to the countries which are getting affected, particularly developing countries, maybe for climate-related research and development, innovation, etc., then your chances of compliance might increase. The third point I'd like to mention is regarding the sectoral scope, and the European Green Deal and the Inception impact assessment document, both of them mention that perhaps only a few sectors would be targeted, and it has already been pointed out by Michael that cement, steel, aluminium are some such sectors that might fit the bill very well. I fully agree with that view, and I would like to emphasize here that it makes sense for you to actually target a few sectors which are really, really vulnerable to carbon leakage, and those would be really emission-intensive sectors like cement, steel, aluminium, etc., so that the environmental justification can be established very well. And if you try to cover a lot many sectors, then it might be difficult, not only because you are not sure what would be the carbon leakage implications of that, but also if you look at the current way the trade happens through global value chains, it would be administratively also very difficult for you to implement. The fourth point,
if I may, in the interest of time, can I ask you to quickly respond to the second part of my question, which is what should India do? How do you think, suppose the EU goes ahead and imposes this unilaterally, what is going to be the impact on India's export opportunities vis-a-vis the EU? Because I know you had done some work on the vulnerability of India's export sectors on this.
Yeah, you're right. Actually, I did as part of my PhD, and I was working with the Government of India think tank back then. And in the run-up to the Copenhagen, we did this analysis of both WTO compatibility as well as trade vulnerability. But if you look at the way now it is being implemented for the fourth phase of the EU ETS, they have changed the the methodology they are going to apply regarding determination of the carbon leakage risk of the sectors. Having said that, if you look at the way the leakage determination has been made, I do have some reservations because it covers, I think, some 94% of the sectors which are under the EU ETS, 94% of the emissions covered by the sectors under EU ETS, which is, I think, huge. And there I was coming that, if you one can question the methodology which has been applied. I am not sure. It is not really clear to me what exactly the basis of that. But that was a point I was trying to make, that you might have too many sectors as prone to carbon leakage, but not all of them can be part of your border carbon adjustment for sure. That is one point. The second, again, coming to the Indian aspect, of course, EU is a very important trade partner of India. And there also comes from a legal angle, the scope of the geographical scope of the BCA. And I think that if you look at the most favored nation clause of the WTO, then it would be difficult for the EU to differentiate among the trading partners based on their situation while implementing the BCA. However, if you are from the very beginning trying to find compliance under Article 20 of GATT, then to my mind, if you actually discriminate among the trading partners, say developing countries or least developed countries who are doing a lot as part of the Paris Agreement and on the track to meet their NDC commitment, etc., you may also need to look at the development and economic situation of those countries, as well as their domestic scenario, what kind of policies they are implementing for climate change purposes. It may be the case that they are not having a ETS kind of thing, but they might have many things, and what would be the cost implications of that. So there
Pastor, we'll come back to you later in the discussion. But the point you've just made is a good entry to our next speaker, Mr. Mahendra Singhi. He's the Managing Director and CEO of Dalmia Cement Bharat Limited. He has 41 years of experience and is best known for being an avid advocate of sustainability. Dalmia Bharat Cement has been ranked as the #1 cement company across the global cement sector by the award-winning research series of Carbon Disclosure Project. In 2019, Mr. Singhi represented Dalmia Cement in the UN Secretary General's Climate Action Summit in New York on the invitation of the Secretary General. He also serves as the president of the Cement Manufacturers Association in India. Mr. Singhi, both Kasturi right now and before that, Michael and Andre were referring to the proposition that there could be sectoral focus rather than economy-wide focus. And steel, cement, aluminium, these are highly emissions intensive sectors. Now, the Indian cement industry is one of the most efficient in the world. You yourself have been personally advocating for low carbon industrialization in India. So if the EU went ahead and introduced a carbon border adjustment mechanism, how do you think it would impact the Indian cement industry's prospects? Would the measure accelerate or would it threaten investments in low carbon and energy efficient technologies?
Great. So happy afternoon, all friends and the panelists. Thanks, Arunabha and Andrew for giving this opportunity. First, I would like to congratulate European Union for coming out with this European Green Deal, which talks of climate neutral Europe. And I think many of other continents, countries can take leaf out of it and can think of how to declare not only the net zero carbon country, but at the same time, climate neutral country. My thought was, and I'll especially come to your question also, but first I will say that after great efforts in 2015, then the Paris Climate Agreement was signed, and that brought together all the countries to take care of and to combat the impact of climate change. That was the effort to deal it not nationally, not continentally, but globally. But it seems if we just go with this mechanism, which broadly I could understand in a short time, that it will be only concentrating on Europe and how to take care of European countries of European Union or the companies of European Union. I think the views which has been expressed by our leader, Shri Jairam Rameshji, very candid and very practical also. At the same time, Kasturi has also given certain ways and means that what can be done. But at the same time, what I would like to say is that one, it should be, whatever say any treaty comes on carbon management, it should be part and parcel of Paris Climate Agreement. It should come under the umbrella of Paris Climate Agreement so that there is a agreement amongst the various countries. Second, the effort should be made by the countries, the continents, or the European Union, that how developing countries like India and others are supported as per Paris Climate Agreement, so that they are all also able to develop low carbon technologies, so that there is no distinction, major distinction left after 10 years, 15 years about the companies or countries who are carbon efficient and who are not. Now coming to your specific question on about cement and particularly how it would impact Indian cement sector. So let me thank Aruna for sharing the message that yes, Indian cement sector is having the best of the technology and the best of the people who manages most energy efficient cement plant. Indian companies are having one of the lowest carbon footprints, and we as a Dalmia Cement are having the lowest carbon footprints in the global cement world as well. We have the roadmap to become carbon negative by 2040. And considering that, and if I hypothetically think that if India exports cement to Britain or to European Union, then definitely European Union would be required to pay some taxes to India. Similarly, if European cement comes to India, then definitely if BCA gets implemented, then surely there would be some tax on the cement which will be imported from European Union. But the here point is not to impose tax, but to create awareness that how each and every cement company, how each and every steel company, how each and every sector works on low carbon technologies, so that at the end, the way UN Secretary General has created a vision of net zero carbon economy, net zero carbon globe by 2050, that happens. And I think one of the important area in this is how developed world who have committed $100 billion a year to developing country to develop on low carbon technologies, that comes forward. And if the European Great Deal can also think of that how they can also provide support so that there are least chances of having carbon tax, but at the same time, there's a very smooth flow of business. So at the end, I would say, let European Union think of how to unite the whole globe and not to be not do anything unilateral. And so I think this is what my view is.
Great, Mr. Singhi, the last points that you made, on how the revenues could be used to actually be transferred to developing countries in case they so that they can improve their standards. We'll come back to that question later because, as Minister Ramesh earlier, he's coined a new acronym. The original CDM has now been replaced by Geram CDM, which is confidence destroying measure. So to avoid a destruction of that confidence, we can come back to how that can be used. But let me just ask you a very quick follow-up question, Mr. Singhi. Give us a sense, give the listeners a sense of the carbon footprint of the Indian cement sector compared to the rest of the world. And then tell us, would tariff barriers in the European Union actually then benefit the Indian cement sector? Because if you have the lowest carbon footprint in the world, you might as well go and sell it wherever you want to go.
Sure. Thanks for a very interesting question. First, I would like to say that in general, the global average of carbon footprint is about 900 kg per ton of cement. It's a combination of say 500 kg to maybe 1300 kg globally. Now, when we compare the figures of US, Europe, and India, you would find that India would be in the range of 650, 670 kg, whereas if we talk of Europe, it would be around say 800, 850, and maybe US also 900, 950, and maybe Japan maybe 650 to 700. And there are companies like our company, a few more companies who are in the range of 525 kg to 575 kg. So there are various ways and means by which the unfortunately tech sector, which is said hard to abate sector or which emits maximum CO2 can be abated. And we have taken that challenge that if we are able to implement carbon capture and utilization projects, not only in my company, but in the cement sector, in the steel sector, some other sector, in the industries like steel, cement, etc., they can make globe a better world in terms of lower CO2 emissions. So point is that whatever say European Union wants to do, because to give message to the whole world that if you emit more, you would be taxed. So my point would be the message, my message to European Union is that if you want that, try to support Indian industry also, as well as other developing countries also, by providing funds which you have committed. As well, if you want to do more, let it be a part of European Green Deal. Thank you.
Okay, that's a strong message. Let me then come to Seema Arora as a representative of Indian industry overall. Seema Arora is the Deputy Director General of the Confederation of Indian Industry, and she is also the head of CII's Center for Excellence on Sustainable Development. She pioneered the creation of services on environment and sustainable development within CII now for more than 25 years, designing the innovation products and frameworks to build the business case for industries to invest in sustainability, including the world's first corporate sustainability label. Seema also serves on the World Economic Forum's Global Agenda Council on the governance of sustainability. Seema, you've heard our three previous speakers, you've heard the briefing presentation. You and I have discussed these matters many times before. Indian industry is under severe strain thanks to the pandemic. At the same time, you have personally worked closely with industry to help them adopt more sustainable practices. So what are your views? Would the unilateral use of a border carbon adjustment result in more sustainability measures within Indian industry, or would it hinder any efforts towards that? Just to get back to the nature of the economic recovery, a couple of weeks ago, we released at CEEW a report called Jobs, Growth and Sustainability, a new social contract for India's recovery. It got front page coverage. It was released by a minister. So there is a lesson there about whether it's our small industry or large industry, that there is an interest in sustainable practices, a new kind of growth. But would unilateral measures elsewhere support that, or would it make it problematic to push the agenda that you've been pushing for more than 2 decades?
Thank you, Anurabha. Good afternoon, everyone, and very interesting conversation so far. So, first part of your question, unilateral use of BCA as a tool, I think it will be really challenging at this stage for Indian industry. And I say this for multiple reasons. Of course, the pandemic has made things difficult, but keeping that aside for a while, we also know that for the last few years, while many industries in the country have worked on their organizational footprint, understanding their carbon emissions, they have mostly focused on scope 1 and 2. There are outliers then, like the Dalmia Cement Group, etc. But mostly they're focused on scope 1 and 2. And scope 3 still is a challenge, which means the complete life cycle of emissions is really not understood by industry. Now, even for a minute, if you assume that companies have started to calculate and understand and identify scope 1, 2, 3, upstream, downstream emissions, reducing those emissions is an altogether different story. And that itself, we see that it takes a lot of effort on the part of companies. Yes, energy efficiency has been strong. Companies have worked on that. But again, I feel when you're talking of emissions across the value chain, it needs much more action. There's also going to be challenges with respect to, the methodology issues. And these were pointed out in the presentation. How the choices by which you calculate the embodied emissions may differ from sector to sector, company to company, the choice of emission factors. Even different sectors do not report their emissions uniformly in a standard way. So there's going to be that kind of challenges. This is aside from the fact that whether there's compatibility between WTO. I'm not commenting on the freight issue at all. Also, one of the major challenge would be that we know that the India's electricity or energy basket has a very high emission intensity due to coal-based thermal power plant being predominant. It's changing, but it's not changing that fast, right? So unless that transition happens rapidly and you replace it with a higher percentage of clean energy in the total energy mix, companies and industries would be really at a back foot, because irrespective of better energy efficiency, they will have to, really not be able to justify because of the, the inherent embodied emission in the electricity generation. So coming to whether it will hinder or whether it will, accelerate, sustainability, this would really depend on how we use the instrument. How do we design it, the timing of the instrument, the approach of the instrument. If it is done as a regulation, well, there'll be some transition. I think it needs to be a hybrid thing. According to me, it will, if we were to, and Mr. Singhi also mentioned this, there was a process by which, there was more awareness created, there was more understanding of what the methodologies are, some hand-holding, some support in terms of, what was mentioned, changing to the best available technologies. We still don't have a list of best available technology sector-wise. So, or some innovative financing mechanisms, which could be along with technology capacity building, then it may have the potential to actually create the roadmap for a long-term, decarbonization of certain sectors which can be picked up. Currently, of course, the pandemic is therefore up and now we need to bring the growth back. As we all know, that's the most important thing. But we all, and the mid-sized companies, as we know, are really badly hit. Your report also, really talks of the MSME sector. And I think one of the ways to link the two, the discussion we are having today on BCA instrument and also the fact that government has put up some kind of a stimulus package. We can't call it green, but there is, of course, the loan dispersal, the credit linkages that are being given to MSMEs to bring them back to life. And if these can be linked to certain kind of carbon criteria, sustainability criteria, and can be given a slightly longer term to be met. It's not now and immediate, but that yes, if MSMEs have to go on to that path, then whenever, and coupled with the, what I was mentioning earlier, the way you design the BCA implementation, then we might get, the export-oriented industries, which may fall in some of the sectors that BCA tool may be implemented on. And the MSME sector may start to understand it. And over a period of time, we may see a shift in the way they're looking at it. So I think it really depends on how we approach it, design it, implement it.
So Seema, just picking up on that, if I may ask a follow-up. You are saying that on one hand, Indian industry, especially the very small micro enterprises, the millions of them, they are not actually, they haven't deployed the resources towards even mapping out their footprint, etc. Now, given the so-called lead time that there is in the way the EU is going about it, do you think this might trigger them to do this? I mean, in a sense, my question is, how do we sensitize Indian industry, large and small and micro, to these global or these regional developments that can prepare them better for what is to come?
So the best way to do this is through the large companies. So we've always used the supply chain route because that really works very well. And I think we've done this for the auto sector, the electronics sector in CII, and this is the only way it works, because if their customer is saying that this is something, and not only just saying and demanding, even helping. That's where I think the mentoring, the capacity building piece is very important, because you just can't prescribe and then forget, And I think if we link the two together, what is happening right now in terms of, the MSME sector, being given some kind of, softer credits, etc., and, loans to come back, and also get the OEMs together and, work with the international community to get some innovative financing mechanisms. There is a possibility to probably make that happen.
Okay, great. So we come to our final speaker, Mr. Chanakya Chaudhary, before we turn to our European representatives. Mr. Chaudhary is the Vice President for Corporate Services at Tata Steel Limited. And since taking up that particular role, Mr. Chaudhary has been driving several initiatives to make Tata Steel's raw material supply chain more robust and sustainable. He also serves on the board of New Millennium Iron Corporation in Canada, M Junction Services Limited, several other companies, including he's the chairman of the board of JUSCO, which is a 100% subsidiary of Tata Steel. And if I may say, both Seema and Mr. Chaudhary served on a working group that CEEW had convened called the Working Group on Mitigation Instruments, and effectively thinking about what are the alternatives before India, whether it's an emissions trading scheme or a nationwide carbon tax or something else, or even voluntary corporate measures that can be put forward. And this is an exercise we've been doing for more than 2 years now. So, Mr. Chaudhary, Tata Steel has production facilities in India and in the European Union, and has interests in the prospects of the steel industry in the global market. The Indian steel policy also proposes significant increase in production over the coming years. It is using different technologies for steel manufacturing in these different plants. So could a EU-driven border carbon adjustment mechanism help it to gain a competitive edge? Or would it undermine Tata Steel's plans for sustainability across its facilities and its markets?
So thanks, Nava, and good evening, everyone else. I think very lucid thoughts in the presentation and everyone else. So yes, you are right. Tata Steel surely has its production facilities in Europe and in India. India surely has its production plans going forward in terms of 300 million tons kind of a vision. And we also have our own plans dovetailed along with it. I think some of the things which have already been said in terms of it has to be a sectoral approach. I'm not getting into the WTO compatibility part because I'm the last guy on the earth to understand fully the WTO requirements and whether we're going to be compatible or not. But surely it should not end up like a non-tariff barrier somewhere coming back into the system. Having said that, I think what Tata Steel has been doing is more global, which is like we get a global view and then we see what is best suited for India and for Europe and kind of take that forward in the respective geographies. We also cross-learn from each other. So you had asked my colleague Mahinder Singhi some time back with regard to the carbon footprint. And you know, it's very interesting that Tata Steel in India today is the benchmark within the integrated steel players on the carbon emissions, which is like about 2.5 tons of carbon dioxide per ton of crude steel. And our plan is to be close to 2 or less than 2 in the next 5 years or so. And our European plant, especially the Netherlands plant, is about 1.8 tons of carbon dioxide. So there's a cross-learning between these two companies. In any case, a lot of technological transfer keeps happening between us. And we also see how, and our colleagues in Europe are a part of all the conversations on this, as we call it, border adjustment tax, and they call it BCA. They've been a part of Eurofer and they've been participating in it. Over there also, there have been some difference of opinion in the whole thing going forward. But I think it's not counterproductive as I see it. It's not that if it comes in, surely it will never be unilateral. And I totally agree with that view. It has to be a thought through subject in terms of what a country gains and the other country loses or gains at the same time. But you know, there are some countries, and we did hear one or two panelists talking about developing countries, developed countries, and so on and so forth. If I look at India, so I'm looking at Tata Steel per se because we are looking at different ways of making steel. There is something called these days the green steel manufacturing process, which is more scrap based rather than iron ore and coal based. And India is also looking at the same way of manufacturing in about 10 to 20 years. As I speak today, one of our smaller scrap based plant is coming up in Haryana. Now, so there is a shift on the manufacturing production based companies looking at lower and lower carbon footprint. That is one. Second is, if I look at the steel which goes from India to Europe and vice versa, which comes from there, last couple of years, there's been a more or less a trade balance between the two. And this is without any carbon adjustments anywhere. Why I want to bring this in is that if this needs to be coming in as a strategic tool, it will have to balance on both sides. When I come to India and I see that it has to be brought in on a level playing field. But when I look at India, India has already taken some steps forward. Mr. Jairam Ramesh would remember he was one of the individuals who pushed the PAT scheme for steel, which was perform, achieve, and trade. But when I look at the sector itself, so the question was, can we do it as a sector? Yes, we should do it as a sector. Aluminium, steel, cement, and so on and so forth. Can't be across the board. But within steel, when we see it, we see a lot of companies at different stages. Now, let's say 50% of those steel companies have to export. Now, everyone is not at the same stage. So on what basis will they get taxed when they are exporting? because everyone's carbon footprint is going to be different. When I look at, again at India, we've had NDCs, as Kasturi was mentioning, we've got a movement towards renewables, may not be at the same speed which she's talking about, Seema was mentioning, but at the same time, we are moving in that direction. And then when I come to, again to India compared to, let's say, China or a US, and we look at the kind of a per capita, emissions, we are still far behind from the developed world. Second, we have economic growth looking at the manufacturing sector in India. So that's going to grow. Keeping everything in mind, personally, I feel that each country is taking decisions on its own. Within those countries, the companies are falling in line. Rather, I would say, if I look at India, it is the sector, and it is then the company which falls in line and decides to do a few things. And going forward, if India has a plan on steel per se for achieving 300 or whatever million tons of steel, and they have NDCs which have been announced, and there are clean energy cesses which are also in place, and we understand the scrap policy is going to come in, the vehicle scrap, etc., etc. So you will have a dual manufacturing processes. One is integrated through iron ore, coal, and more will go into scrap. Even if border adjustment or border carbon adjustments don't come or do come, the Indian steel industry per se will be ready to meet the challenge. However, the larger issue, and this is happening in our sector, I see more and more countries are moving away from multilaterals to bilaterals, or even to protections and safeguards. And steel per se in the last 3 years, and I'm talking pre-pandemic, started from US and many other countries, have put in safeguards to ensure that domestically produced steel is consumed within the country. That's going to be a big challenge, because there is bound to be anti-dumpings and safeguards, which will be much higher than any kind of border.
You're saying already the steel sector is getting sort of buffeted by sort of unilateral safeguard measures in major economies, and on top of this, if this comes, it's a different kind of crisis that might come. Okay, before I turn over to Andre, I have one final question to Jairam. It's coming from one of the listeners. You were in government, Jairam, when the European Union at one stage had suggested on aviation levies. And then that same story got repeated a few years later, when eventually there was a multilateral deal through the ICAO in 2016, a few months after Paris. But if there is some lesson there, could you reflect on it? How do you even bring about something that looks unilateral initially, but can eventually come to a multilateral stage, and especially the use of the revenues from any kind of tariff measure? If that could be used, as many speakers have said, for maybe technology development and transfer or joint development in other countries, could that be a mitigating measure?
Well, it's an interesting thought that, the ICAO framework provided ultimate solution to an issue which initially there was a lot of negative reaction. I think we should explore, certainly we could explore that. But, I'm, Arunabha, very skeptical about this use of the revenues argument, because, who's to decide where the revenue is going to be used? You go back into the old CDM tamasha that we had. I don't think that the use of the revenue can be a mitigating factor for the basic WTO incompatibility, any border adjustment measure. But it's an interesting thought that you have raised, that India had the same type of reaction, or not only India, but other countries also had the same type of negative reaction to civil aviation, and ultimately we came around as part of a multilateral framework. I think that's important. I mean, it can't be seen to be EU driven. You know, it has to be driven through a multilateral process if it is to be politically acceptable.
In fact, in both the ICAO deal and the Montreal Protocol amendment at Kigali for HFC phase down, both of which happened in the same month, October 2016, the approach was actually differentiation, and that countries that had a much lower footprint or had much more efficient plants or aircraft, etc., had actually a longer timeline to start phasing down. So let me turn over back to Andre. I know we have some European representatives who want to weigh in on what we've heard. So Andre, over to you.
Thank you, Arunabha. Fascinating discussion and very interesting to hear from people that have thought through this and have written about this in India, as we will hear and have heard from others around the world. Turning over now to Robert Jan-Jekyll, you know, in the end, you know, Galileo Galilei said that it still moves, but and still you will be facing running out of free allocation at some point, Robert Jan. Not you personally, but the company that you work for and the sector that you work for. Again, you have your colleagues here from the industry as well. But you know, what is your take? You know, whether it is ArcelorMittal or it is a general discussion. My recollection is last time when we had a discussion about border carbon adjustment on the Phase 4 ETS review, everybody ran out. Industry ran out, and nobody wanted to have anything to do with border carbon adjustment. And somebody didn't get the memo. I can't remember was Arcelor or ThyssenKrupp, but somebody didn't get the memo because there was one company that still supported that steel company. But what is the general tenor of the discussion within the business community?
Thanks, Andre. Thanks, hello everybody. Thanks for the opportunity to give our views here. Well, the general view is as has been mentioned, we're up for a revolution in Europe. I mean, that's just how it is. We will be one of the biggest emitters. We maybe will be the biggest emitter in Europe, and we have to be carbon neutral. And you have to see this discussion in this picture. I miss it a bit in this context. So how we're going to do this revolution? At the same time, so the Commission says, all the European policy says you have to decarbonize to that. We will enable your decarbonization. Fine. Let's see how that works best. And this discussion is one policy instrument for this decarbonization. Today, we launched our climate report. I can send it to everybody for Europe. So we had one for the world. Now we had one for Europe for 2030 targets. So this is extremely relevant for this discussion. How we're going to do it. So main message is, technology is not a problem. It's the policy enablers. How are we going to finance this? Is it via the hydrogen way? Is it going via the smart carbon way? How we're going to do it? First of all, we need to produce in Europe. We need to comply with the ETS. We need to avoid this carbon leakage. We need to invest in all these low carbon technologies. So you see this carbon, how we see the carbon border adjustment as the fundamental basis, as a starting point for all of this. Because without this, forget the whole climate ambition in Europe. Because then Europe will not prove to India or other countries that is policy successful, that you can do it. So what you need to do, high ambition, high, in this case, carbon leakage protection, but also incentivizes for the technology to be rolled out. Now, how do we see this as a design? I think I would like to just quote Ms. Kastouris, who just mentioned two very important points, which I miss a bit in the discussion also of the think tank. First of all is the environment target. I think that is crucial. We're not talking about a trade policy here. We're talking about a climate policy. And some people who are stuck in trade policy, of course, get very nervous because they're off-bound, basically. We're talking climate policy. We're talking the environment target, the definition of that on WTO. So thanks for that comment. I think that's the new basis. And the other one is sectoral. So what do you focus on? you focus on, as Mr. Das said, you focus on added value of the sectors, and for that you need so the volumes of the sectors, but also the who are at most risk of carbon leakage. You're not talking about something simple. We do it because it's simple. No, we don't do it because it has a lot of carbon leakage impact. And so you focus on the sectors at the risk of carbon leakage and sectors which have a lot of carbon. And then these are not a few. So I think that I missed that in the discussion, the added value, why you do it, because it's not so easy to make this. We're trying to make it as workable and as simple as possible, which is not easy, but we think it's doable. But then do it on this way. Indeed, then it's the primary sectors which is high risk. So we're talking fertilizer, steel, cement as basis, and maybe some others. Crucial in the discussion also is the issue of to make it workable. We're talking Europe wants to have climate as its new, let's say, power game, if you want, and to prove that it's successful. Then the issue, there's a difficult issue to solve, but it's not so difficult. Source shifting, as you have, as Michael already mentioned, that's not an easy one. It is indeed not easy, but you don't need to do it. So if you want to have all the data of these plans somewhere, it's an undoable thing. We have different collection systems. Other governments have not the same, let's say, possibilities sometimes, or I phrase it diplomatically here, of their plans. No, it's about climate diplomacy. It's about if another country, let's say in this case, simple, for Andre, Canada, or Ontario has the same policy, which it's getting close to, then you say we have a default levy, and we're gonna see if you have the same kind of incentives for this sector. In our case, steel, can be anything, yeah. And if the country is indeed having the same kind of incentive and pathway, then you say, okay, then the levy is out. If you don't do that, and you allow countries to import with their happen to be, if they have it, clean technology or plans, and export the dirty ones or keep it somewhere else, you miss the opportunity to incentivize other countries. You miss the opportunity as EU to have diplomacy, and you miss the opportunity to have a global climate impact. And that's the whole purpose of this too. So I think that should be in the discussion too. And if you do it like that, make it much more simple, but also more effective. So one of these two things. One other issue which is very important in the discussion is the issue of absorption. We're talking about, we don't talk about only an EU to ETS compliance system or something like that. We're talking about a package. We're talking about decarbonization pathway. So if most companies importing to Europe, by the way, it's already 20 million tons of steel, and you can compare how many tons of CO2 already are basically imported into Europe of CO2. Massively. So this is a massive carbon leakage already taking place, which a policy doesn't deal with for the moment. It basically only takes into account investment leakage for the moment, and we think it should incorporate all carbon leakage. This is very important. But companies importing into Europe, it's just a few percentage of a portfolio, and often based on variable cost. So the levy, that's what the design of the levy in Europe is, has to take into account that also these imports are incentivized. So thinking in a way, coming back to the environment and the climate purpose of the issue, to incentivize also these imports. If you have only the discussion just for our Indian colleagues also, there are some people in Europe, we think they're against the border adjustment to frighten everybody. But they say, well, if it comes, fine. But then we skip all your free allocation right away. And as Andre said, eventually that will be skipped because that's in the portfolio, that's in the development. But if you do that, what would you need? You need to be able to pass on all your carbon costs, not only of your marginal plant, but of your whole production site. And you know how that works. Steel site, we want to run full. You need to be, those are all these volumes and the risk of carbon leakage, not just the ones who we have to buy carbon for. So all of that, if you want to produce that, you need to be able to pass it on in your price. It's simple, huh? The problem is, it's not possible because there's the issue of absorption coming in. The price which an importer needs has is not the price of the carbon border levy or something, and which this is a phenomenon which is already taking place, of course, in trade defense measures, is lower than that. So the price is basically then set by importers and other phenomena, which means that the European producers cannot push on their full cost, which you already have now, by the way, as well. But then it will be more aggravated, in fact, much more clear. So if you do that at first, there's no chance that this instrument will work. So my other message is here. Yes, carbon border adjustment is crucial, but only if it's designed in an effective way. So that is very important. Effective, workable, simple as possible. So this full auctioning, as André said, is indeed a non-starter. It's also not based in the Green Deal one on any impact assessment. It was not based on that. Now it will come. And we hope that, of course, the Commission will use the right impact assessments for this, which takes into account absorption. And then you will clearly see this phenomenon. And why? Then how this design, to make it effective, at least you can take away some, let's say, design options. Also politically, full auctioning at this moment in time, if there's no business case, you cannot produce. Members say, steel industry is already in crisis. Well, many are now, not all industries with COVID, but steel industry is already in crisis. Governments are not going to allow steel plants to close because of this. So the full auctioning is politically also not so handy to say, maybe by people who want to stop the border adjustment, that's possible. But we have to, so the tax issue is over. WTO, there was also scared, WTO is not possible. As also said by Ms. Kasturi-Das, you have to, it's not a trade issue, it's a climate issue. We go to Article 20, and that the environmental objective is crucial for this, how to do it. So that is also solved. Now we have to solve this full auctioning issue with the absorption cost. And then I think we can come to a design of the border adjustment, which is indeed helping the decarbonization pathway. And that's what it really needs. Let me see if I forgot something. I think I've covered most of our of the elements which we need. Yeah, one more thing. What is crucial is that the border adjustment is focused on the cost we have of the European production, which compete most with the imports without carbon cost, without the decarbonization cost, if you want. And for the moment, those are the costs where you don't buy allowances, where you have to buy the allowances for. So these are the marginal volumes. And those volumes, it's crucial that those volumes can compete with the imports. There's ways if there will be a, let's say, softer protection, then you don't see any impact on these competition, and then these marginal production volumes cannot compete with the outside world. The whole issue is you cannot be half pregnant. We're doing a full force climate policy. We need a full force protection for the decarbonization. Otherwise, it just doesn't work. Not for the European industry, but also not to show the world we have leadership in Europe. And others will say, guys, that doesn't work. So it's crucial for Europe to show it works. We can decarbonize. We have a decarbonization basis. And for that, we put on the basis of that our additional policies. And the rest of the world show, hey guys, look at this. It works. Now we will discuss with you how we can decarbonize the rest of the global emissions. So that is really a crucial point. So it means it's really crucial we keep at this moment free location as discussed in ETS, border adjustment based on the cost in addition, so nothing double on the cost of ETS and the decarbonization of these marginal volumes. I think I covered everything.
Did you cover exports?
And export is indeed a tricky issue. You're right, André. Export is indeed a tricky issue, WTO-wise. So we're working still on that. There are people who have high hopes that this is also solvable, but I have no conclusion on that yet.
Okay,
but it's really, you're right. That is, there's two I think remaining issues left. This is one, and the other one is basically international conflict, but that you cannot solve. We have a new policy that we have to do. So this is the main things. Yeah.
Let me come back for a second to Mr. Ramesh, if I may. You know, the ghost of Copenhagen seems to be haunting us. The ghost of, you know, I mean, I spent enough nights sleeping there and then slept 36 hours straight after that. But let me ask you this, you know, I mean, it's all got to be UNFCCC, great. But, you know, I chaired, for my sins, I chaired response measures under UNFCCC for 3 years until Katowice. And I mean, bringing something like this would have to come under response measure. There's no other place to bring it in the UNFCCC. The WTO doesn't want it, or in general has tried to avoid this discussion. The UNFCCC doesn't want it. So where is the forum that we discuss this? Because it is, you know, if you want a multilateral, let's bring in a multilateral forum. Where would you bring it, Mr. Ramesh?
Well, I agree. I mean, you know, it has fallen between not two stools, but it has fallen between many stools. And it will continue to fall below many stools. I mean, and right now we are still grappling with the accounting of the Paris Agreement. I mean, we have an agreement in Paris. We have commitments made in Paris. And 5 years down the road, we still don't have a system that everybody has agreed to for accounting of these commitments. And I have always believed from the days of Copenhagen onwards that commitments have to be bottom up, but accounting has to be top down. You know, if accounting is also bottom up, like commitments, then, you know, we're not going to be making any progress whatsoever. Now, I think we should spend our political capital. The question is, political capital is limited. Political capital is dwindling. What do we spend this limited and dwindling political capital on? Do we spend it on border adjustment mechanisms, or do we spend it on getting the Paris Agreement commitment on reporting made it into a reality? And I would say right now the priority should be to get the reporting system of Paris finalized and clinched before we open another border adjustment mechanism front. This is my view.
It's interesting.
We don't want to fight on two fronts.
You know, this is being called in the EU, it's being called CBAM, the Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism. It's interesting. At CEEW, we have developed another CBAM, which just as of yesterday, the UNFCCC has shown great interest in. It's called the Capacity Building Assessment Matrix. It's a methodology we've developed to assess the reporting capacity of all developing countries, and so that you get a standardized approach towards building up that transparency mechanism. So multiple new acronyms being formed for the same kind of choice of letters. Andre, you wanted to ask anyone else a question? Otherwise, I have another question for Kasturi.
Go ahead. The only thing I would like to do is also, Arunabha, to invite also our audience to raise their electronic hand, but you proceed first, please.
Yeah, Kasturi, we cut you off a little bit. So we are a little short on time. So you were on point 4 of giving, you were kind of serving as a consultant to the EU, giving them a way to do this, sort of in response to what Jairam initially asked. If there is a way to make it WTO compatible, tell me. So what's your point 4 and 5? And then we will move to other questions.
First of all, I'm not serving to you as consultant, that's for sure. When I was asked by the Department of Commerce of Government of India to do the study, I had similar conclusion that they would lie in the details and that you look for Article 20. So my conclusions have not changed if you look at my papers. So I'm just giving you a very objective assessment of from a legal angle. That is the first point. The second is I think fourth point was about the geographical scope. I have already mentioned, and I think there is, from a strictly legal angle, not political, there is scope for differentiation. That is the first thing. And the other point I would like to mention here is about the process EU has to follow if the BCA has to be implemented, and there should be something like which is called in WTO parlance of Article 20 Chapiu, basic fairness and due process that should be followed. And that could be interpreted in different ways as per the case law. So it could be whether it is transparent enough, whether it is predictable, whether it offers the affected countries due process of expressing their views, whether bilateral negotiations or multilateral negotiations are taking place, all of that. It may also help if you, have sufficient phase-in time, and that is something some of the colleagues have discussed here, that what is the timeline, that is going to be very important. And I think that from WTO compatibility angle also, it makes sense and it might help under Article 20 that if you allow for enough phase-in for the countries, and as Seema was pointing out, and I'll bring it the Indian context here, look at the SMEs. I think there is a case for just transition for the SMEs, and it's not only about India, it could be about LDCs or other developing countries where there are some such kind of inequality in place. So there may be a case for that kind of thing, and you might need more time to prepare for it, and the kind of timeline that you might be thinking of, that may not be very easy, particularly in the post-COVID world, as some of the speakers have pointed out, that we are grappling, all of the countries mostly, and particularly developing countries, grappling with the pandemic on the one hand, and then the economic and social compulsions. And I'm not specifically talking about India. But also, if you look at the WTO forecast, that trade is might plummet up to 32% by end of 2020. That's huge. And IMF yesterday has sent another signal that the economic implications could be even harder. So in such a scenario, I think it would be exceedingly difficult to imagine you bringing in BCAs in the kind of timeline, because the timeline was proposed, I think, when it was initially proposed, and that was pre-COVID world. You have to appreciate that we are living in a completely different world 7 months down the line.
Okay.
It's very important here how you look at the timeline.
Thanks, Kasturi.
If I can, Arunabha, one thing that we learned into some discussion that we had is that this is beginning to perk up a little bit at the WTO. It sounds like the Russian Federation has brought this to the Committee on Market Access and asking the EU as to, what are your intentions? Are they honorable, as they say in other fora? And that was, in a way, followed by China, United States, and a few Latins asking questions. I don't know if anybody wants to comment, because one of the things that we hear here in this forum is the fact that people either do not believe that this is compatible with WTO. We also heard the same thing on the discussion with the US, where basically the statement was, maybe Michael, you want to jump into this, but I remember the statement being made that this is, for 20 years, we've been told that this is not WTO compatible. Now it is being brushed aside and is becoming WTO compatible by an act of God. I don't know if anybody wants to comment on that.
Andre Sorbert, I think on WTO you had them yourselves on the conference like this, and they mentioned it like that.
Yeah.
And that's also the echoes we hear from WTO. So maybe some other echoes have been there in the past, but the new echoes or sounds from the WTO directly, also in your own conference, also to us, also to others, are clearly saying that this is indeed possible. Indeed, non-discrimination, Article 2.3. If you pass that, the non-discrimination ones, you go exactly. But they always say, and that's also said in your conference, depends on the definition of the environmental definition. That's what it depends on. That's what they always said. I think the line is very clear on the WTO.
I have a question, in the remaining few minutes we have left, maybe we can squeeze in a couple of questions, but I have a question for our industry representatives, Seema, Mr. Singhi, Mr. Chaudhary. Let's look a little beyond carbon border adjustment, and let's look at India-EU cooperation. It's interesting that all three of you have, in your statement so far, made it very clear that there is either in some sectors or in some industries there's already significant a movement in India in terms of lower carbon footprint, or there is significant desire for developing technologies jointly, or through the supply chain, or learning from your plants, for instance, Chanakya, you were mentioning. So here's the question. Last year, in the lead up to the Secretary General's Climate Action Summit, India and Sweden were made charge of the industry transition track. Now, what would need to happen for kind of an India-EU tech platform that could help move industry, both in the EU and in India, to move towards more sustainable practices or develop new technologies altogether, which would be perhaps more politically compatible, use the political capital that Jairam was referring to in a more constructive way? All three of you, I would love your thoughts. And of course, I would love your thoughts, Robert, as well. Okay, Mr. Singhi, go ahead.
So a great question. And in fact, I am part of that Indo-Sweden cooperation in which industries are working together with the government. And it will be a great opportunity for India and EU to work together. Reason being is that the Indian industries have the desire, they have the knowledge also, they have the right people also who can implement that. What is not there is, like Robert had also highlighted, is the innovative financing. You need innovative financing. You need the MDBs, like multilateral development banks, who can come along with the industry first to take the risk, and if the project gets viable, then reap the benefits also. So I think European Union, like they have declared in European Green Deal, that they will be working on circular economy, they will be working on financing. So if Green Deal gets implemented with India, I think globe would be benefited and India would also be benefited. Thank you.
Mr. Chaudhary?
Yeah, so I tend to agree with what Mahinder Singhi just mentioned, because somewhere I think at a company level, when I look back, I see a lot of these technology sharing platforms already existing between EU and India. But it is more a company level initiative. For us, it comes a little easier because we are present in Europe and we are present in India. And Haisarna is one such project which we are trying to kind of go from a pilot stage to a commercial stage. But I also tend to agree further with Mr. Singhi that innovative financial solutions, financial investments are required. And it will not come in as an investment from Tata Steel because it's a huge investment, because it's also a huge breakthrough. It will actually, when I mentioned to you that, if our carbon footprint is 2.4 tons today, if this comes as a commercial breakthrough, it will automatically go down by about 0.6 to 0.7 tons, which is huge, right? So we will need that kind of a thing. What I think is required is if you have a bilateral or a EU-India FTA, and this comes in as a part of that, saying let's have a technology sharing platform, and we should share technology and we could share the benefits, and financial instruments are brought in, it will make a lot of sense. Because I tell you, leave alone everything else, leave alone what I just heard from a colleague from the steel sector talking about how it makes sense to bring in as fast as possible this carbon adjustment tax. I think every individual company and every individual country is looking at reducing emission levels, reducing carbon footprints. Now, we also looked at when Mr. Singhi talked about, last year in September, signing off of being carbon neutral by before 2050 and so on and so forth. So every company and every country is looking at all that. So I think it's a good thought. Only thing is, can it be done on a multi-platform, multi-based platform? I doubt. I think it's better to do it as a bilateral, and EU-India kind of a platform would be a good platform to start with, because I think we have a lot of things in common going for each other. Yeah.
Okay. Okay.
I have a suspect, Rama. I have Mr. Suresh Chandra Sharma, who raised his hand. So we have one. We caught the fish. I think we have to give him the
Arunava, I may just get disconnected in between because I have a 6 o'clock another meeting. So if it is an overpowering signal, I have to disconnected, connected.
Let's allow for
thank you in
this.
advance. Yeah. Let's get in one
Thank
question. Yes, Mr. Sharma. You might be on mute, Mr. Sharma. Can you hear us?
Okay. The intention was there.
Okay. Well, until we're waiting for Mr. Sharma, maybe Seema, you can come in with your thoughts on my question.
Yes. So yes, I think. So I think that, you know, it would be maybe more practical and maybe more effective to have a Indo-US business coalition on climate action to take something like this forward. While the government bilateral discussions happen, and I'm sure many things could be put into that framework of government to government collaboration, we have seen in the past that, you know, if business sector also takes the collaboration forward, it accelerates the pace. And I think we should design it such that we focus on some sectors and not just look at everything. Prioritize, create some win-wins, go get some pilots and demonstration projects going, ask for that innovative financing that is required, go to the government and say, this is how private action can bring these gains. Now you add your weight behind it and get us scale. I think that's how we should do it. Thank you.
Very well said. Very well said.
Robert, any thoughts on this?
Yes, thanks. I think this is a very good idea, but it sounds also what we're doing in Europe. And as I mentioned, technology is not the issue. Or what we are focusing is the decarbonization pathway and the decarbonization policy cost, basically. And those have to be enabled by the policy. So it's a bit what you said, Ms. Aroa, is also, hey, let's get to our government. Let's say this is what we can do. Enable these policies to allow us to do it. It's not so different as we have just discussed. What the difference is that we're not talking here in Europe. It's still, I'm making it a bit black and white, but the technology part is there, and it's there, and we should not neglect it. But the technology we are developing in a certain stage that they can be rolled out for the moment. Yeah, our big problem is the policy enabling, because also the costs come from the policy. Now, this is what we try to, let's say, this incentive we try to allow with the border adjustment. It's, I would say, almost it's compatible what you try to, if you would do what you just mentioned, it's compatible with that, because it would mean that if the border adjustment will come, you will do that initiative. The European Union comes to India. Hey guys, what are you doing for incentives? But we are doing this and this, and that it fits really together. I think this is a great compatible idea, but it's not replacing the other one, you know.
So let me ask just one concluding question, but maybe if any of you want to pick it up, because one would think, based on history, if you want, that you would have gotten a very negative reaction, and basically, the Indian audience would say, hell no. I'm not hearing hell no, or am I hearing? I'm hearing, well, there's a way we can make this work. Is that a correct? Is that a correct interpretation? We all take some, if you remember some of these movies, you always take something away from a conversation. Is this what we take away from the conversation? Anyone wants to react quickly?
Hiram, is it a hell no or is it a hell but?
Well, as I told you, this is not something that I would, spend my time and political capital on. It's certainly not. The bigger things to do. And this is, in my view, this is a dead end. You can try to find, creative ways of making it WTO compatible. Even the English language will not help you to make it WTO compatible. I mean, I have spent a good part of 2-3 years on this issue, morning and night. And this is not a productive route to take.
Okay.
Arunabha, you want to conclude on this?
Well, I don't want to conclude. I think I just wanted to capture what I think are the key messages that we've got from a very interesting conversation. Jairam is very clearly saying, look, whether it's hell no or hell but, it's, it will destroy confidence. It's a confidence destroying measure. It's a CDM. And think about where and how you want to use your limited political capital. But at the same time, if I may completely go to the other side, Kasturi is saying, you can potentially, figure out a WTO wiggle in this, but it will clearly depend on the fact that objectives will matter. And it's the environmental objectives rather than trade objectives, but we'll see how that plays out. Mr. Singhi is actually quite buoyant about how, the Indian cement industry can fare, but is actually much more forthcoming about simply saying, look, we need more tech cooperation and more innovative financing for technology transfer. If that happens, maybe something can happen. Meanwhile, and I've been in many conversations with Mr. Chaudhary, where he has always highlighted, as he did today, that there's a lot of company level learning that goes on and voluntary company level actions that are already underway. And we've got to somehow figure out a way to prioritize or bring that into the framework, which brings me to what Seema said, which is that using large companies to drive change across the value chain, the supply chain, can begin to spur a different kind of action. But that is already happening in India and needs to perhaps speed up while we keep in mind the pandemic and the crisis we are in. With all these different formulations, to me, Robert is saying, look, none of this is a substitute for what he said, the full pregnancy route of dealing with an ambitious carbon target and as well as an ambitious kind of prevention of carbon leakage approach. So I'm not sure we've got two solutions, but I think we've certainly got not design elements, but definitely the political hooks and the technological hooks and the business hooks by which a conversation between India and EU can happen before something unilateral and disastrous ends up. CEEW actually serves as the technical partner to the EU-India Climate and Clean Energy Partnership, which is a government-to-government level partnership. We'd be happy to continue this conversation, picking up on some of the answers or the hints of answers that our stellar speakers have provided us today. Andre, I'll leave the final word to you. Thank you so much.
I'd like to, Michael, any final words from you? You're my partner. And, very quick, what do you take away from this? The hell no or hell but?
Oh, I wouldn't dare to try to summarize it better than Arunabha just did. That was wonderful and I think really helpful. But I think we hit on a few of the issues that we internally had already identified as challenges. They will be difficult to overcome, and yet I would say the EU has shown that it is committed to doing this, and I think there's a lot of pressure, so I wouldn't expect it to just go by the wayside anytime soon. That would be my takeaway.
Yeah, I mean, to me, I'm encouraged by the fact that it was not a hell no, that there is a dialogue to be had here. I heard I've had other interaction with other jurisdictions which were a lot more harsh than this on this topic. The question will be, is this going to be a cooperative effort or this is going to be an adversarial effort? If it's an adversarial effort, it has the opportunity of breaking things. If it's a cooperative effort, and there are ways to make this into a cooperative effort, I think not only with India, but between especially the major trading partner within the G20, I think then it has a real opportunity to maybe find a solution. Certainly, there needs to be a solution for the simple reason that at least I don't have a steel plant, so I can pontificate as much as I want. But a number of people have steel plants and chemical plants, and they're gonna be facing with 55 or 50 or 65% caps in the EU, which increases the linear reduction factor to about 5%. Now that's a hell of a linear reduction factor. And unless we find a solution, they're going to run out of free allocation. And frankly, I look at this as not an effort to deindustrialize Europe. I'm looking at this as an effort to decarbonize Europe. So I do hope that this is what we are going to end up with. But as Arunabha said, I think that the important thing is that we have a dialogue. I think it's a good platform. Again, our next stop on the global tour is the Republic of Korea with Ambassador Choi and a number of other of his colleagues. But we do hope that we will come back, Arunabha. Our intention was to try towards the end of the year, or maybe at the beginning of the year, because the proposal from the Commission is expected somewhere in the middle of next year, I believe, second half of the year. The idea was to try, COVID permitting and people being able to travel permitting, to actually convene a significant meeting of many of our partners in these town halls in Brussels to discuss this face-to-face. It's a dream, but we all have to dream in this business, or else we wouldn't be in this business. So again, Arunabha, thank you very much for being a good partner. We met electronically and we had the opportunity to have a good discussion. And thank you all to all the panelists. I had hoped that my European colleagues would have been more vocal behind the scene. I know there are a few of them, but next time maybe. Thank you all very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks to all the speakers. Thank you so much.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.